Over the past number of weeks, Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar.
If these allegations are true, they represent an outrageous affront to Canada's sovereignty. Our citizens must be safe from extrajudicial killings of all kinds, most of all from foreign governments.
What we have just learned today in the House is something that shocks the safety and security that so many Canadians rely on. It is outrageous, it is shocking, and it is going to have deep and devastating impacts to Canadians.
Dominic LeBlanc is the Minister of Public Safety and Intergovernmental Affairs, and he joins me now. Minister, thanks for taking the time on a significant day.
Good evening, David.
I wonder, I was in the House of Commons when the Prime Minister stood and gave his statement. I've never seen anything like that. What exactly does Canada know, or what more can you tell us about what Canada knows about India's role in this, or alleged role?
So I obviously can't say more than what the Prime Minister said in the House of Commons. We thought it was important, as this information was increasingly becoming public, for the Prime Minister to say that some weeks ago we were made aware of credible allegations around a potential link between Indian government agents and the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. As you said, that is an extraordinary moment. If in fact it's proven to be true, it's an extraordinary violation of Canada's sovereignty. We're obviously deeply concerned about the safety and security of Canadians. The Indo-Canadian community will understandably feel a great sense of concern today. So we wanted them to know that we're very much aware of that concern. I met with the RCMP as recently as this morning, who assured me that they have all of the necessary measures in place to ensure the protection of Canadians, but also to investigate fully an active homicide investigation that's taking place in Vancouver.
So we're talking about the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who was a Sikh temple president and a Khalistani activist. He believed in an independent Sikh homeland from India. And since he's been gunned down this summer, there have been allegations and suspicion within the community that the Indian government was involved. So you've said agents of India. That's a very broad term, deliberately broad, I assume. But are we talking about allegations that implicate Narendra Modi himself? Or are we talking about the lower levels of the Indian government here?
But again, the Prime Minister raised this issue directly with Prime Minister Modi when he was at the G20 summit. The director of CSIS, David Vigneault, traveled to India as recently as a couple of weeks ago to raise it directly with the head of the Indian Intelligence Service. We have been raising this issue and confronting the Indian officials with this information from the moment these credible allegations were brought to our attention. I'm obviously not going to speculate, David, and it would be irresponsible to get into the details of what particular allegation around what particular agent of the Indian government, because the most important thing for us is ultimately the RCMP and their security partners are able to successfully prosecute people for this very violent crime against a Canadian citizen. So we really want to be careful to allow them to do the important work that they're doing in a robust way right now.
So what's the timeline of when you became aware of what you call these credible allegations? I mean, obviously the G20, things were very tense and frosty there, and I think we now know why. Trade talks were put on hold. I think we now know why. But what's the timeline here of when this was elevated to the senior levels of your government and you took it as seriously as you did it to lead to today?
And also, you saw earlier that the Foreign Affairs Minister expelled from Canada a senior diplomat from the Indian High Commission in Ottawa. The Prime Minister said that a number of weeks ago, we became aware of the serious allegations and these credible allegations. Again, I don't think I have regular briefings with security officials since I became the Public Safety Minister. So I was made aware a few weeks ago, as the Prime Minister was, about the potential serious allegations and the credible nature of these allegations of a potential link with agents of the Indian government.
But, you know, we've talked a lot during the foreign interference issues throughout the spring and the summer that intelligence is not evidence, and not to take intelligence at face value. Obviously, this moves to another threshold by the fact that the head of CSIS, the National Security Advisor, went to India, and the Prime Minister did what he did just inside. those doors. So how should Canadians interpret that in terms of evidentiary thresholds and intelligence thresholds, which we have talked a lot about over the course of this year? Put it in context.
And you're right, that is a challenge. The ultimate evidentiary threshold will be determined by a competent court in an ultimate judicial proceeding. So it's not politicians that decide the evidentiary threshold. We hope very much that a criminal court in British Columbia will be able to hold accountable those that perpetrated this crime. But for the Prime Minister to stand up today and bring to Canadians' attention the serious nature of these allegations, we thought was important for two reasons. One, because this information was starting to circulate in the public space. We think it's important to reassure Canadians that they're safe in Canada, that the government is taking all the necessary steps to ensure the safety of the Indo-Canadian community and others who may be subject to threats, intimidation, or, heaven forfend, potential violence like this. But we also think it's important to tell Canadians that the security agencies are very much involved in an active homicide investigation. And it's important for all of us to let them do their work, so ultimately there can be prosecutions before Canadian courts.
You say this was getting into the public space. Minutes before the Prime Minister rose in the House of Commons today, the Globe and Mail pushed out a story citing intelligence sources, spelling out exactly, more or less, what the Prime Minister said in the House of Commons. Was it because there was something else coming from the Globe and Mail? Did that accelerate your timeline? Is that what you mean by it was in the public space?
Again, journalists do their important work free of interference from governments. Your colleagues in the press gallery and others are doing the important work that you do in a free and democratic country. So we thought that once these allegations were increasingly becoming public, they should hear from the elected leaders of the Canadian government that, first of all, it's important to remain calm. It's important to understand that there is a judicial and security process, a security process, we hope leading to a judicial process, I should be very precise, that's underway. And we think it's important for Canadians to be reassured and to allow, in a country of the rule of law, these processes to take place in the most appropriate way.
So when the National Security Advisor, when the head of CSIS, and when the Prime Minister raised this with Prime Minister Modi and other officials in India, did the government promise to cooperate? Did they deny? What can you tell us about India's response to Canada when confronted with these allegations?
Again, we made it clear to the Indian government authorities that we expected, that we were in possession of these credible allegations, and we very much expected the Indian security officials to cooperate with the Canadian security officials that have the responsibility under Canadian law to investigate the murder of a Canadian citizen, a homicide on Canadian soil.
What indications did you get?
Again, the security officials can speak to the specific conversations they had. I was not in those meetings. I was told by our security officials who went to India to have those meetings that they were very blunt, very direct, and very candid with their Indian counterparts. But as the investigation is ongoing, it hasn't led to arrests and charges. We hope that it can and will. But the most important thing is to allow that investigation to proceed and to not comment on specific parts of who's cooperating with whom for what particular investigation.
When you and Minister Jolie spoke to reporters about an hour ago, she said, and you referenced, a diplomat has been expelled, somehow connected with the Indian intelligence services, is what I took from her answer. Is that enough? I mean, this is an allegation of an extrajudicial killing, and a single diplomat has been expelled. Will there be an escalation in this or a stronger response?
But again, that was something we did today. This person, my understanding, is the head of the intelligence service at the High Commission in Ottawa. But we will not hesitate to take further and other actions as more information comes to light, as the investigation proceeds. I mean, this is not case closed. This is an important moment in a complicated criminal case, and the government will do everything that we can to hold those that perpetrated this crime to account and to protect Canadians on Canadian soil.
Hardeep Singh Nijjar was shot in his truck. Two masked men seen running away from the scene. You talked about steps you're taking to keep members of the Indian and Sikh community safe. I mean, what can you tell us about what your government is doing and can do to help improve safety in the diaspora, which has to be very nervous right now?
Understandably, and I've spoken to some colleague parliamentarians about the concern in their communities. So we are listening carefully to these concerns. My meeting with senior RCMP leadership, including the Commissioner himself this morning, was very much focused on have we taken all possible steps to ensure the safety and security of leaders of this community in Canada, of others who may be the subject of threat and intimidation. The RCMP have assured me that they have, for a number of weeks, been working on a plan to deal with the very eventuality of what became public this afternoon. So I have every confidence that they're doing everything that they possibly can to ensure community safety.
Justice Ogg is due to start her mandate today to look at foreign interference. Do you think that role is broad enough and robust enough now that we are talking on the floor of the House of Commons about a foreign state involved allegedly in an extrajudicial killing?
Absolutely it is. And in the terms of reference that we negotiated throughout the summer with the opposition, Privy Council officials went through them with Justice Ogg before she accepted the appointment as Commissioner. It very much contemplated that it's not only Russia and China, other state and non-state actors are interfering.
We're talking election meddling, not assassinations, right?
Yeah, but so, I mean, a senior jurist like Justice Ogg will also not do something that will get in the way of a criminal prosecution or a criminal investigation. That's also in the terms of reference. But her ability to look at how India has interfered with the diaspora communities in Canada, other activities of the Indian government. The terms of reference very much allow her to follow the evidence of foreign interference. Obviously, as you properly note, it's not a criminal trial and it won't make findings of criminal culpability. That is properly in the hands of a constituted criminal court.
But just as a final point, and we have to let you go, but I'm struck by the fact that the Prime Minister is saying that they have evidence, or credible evidence, that India was involved in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. And the response we see today is a rebuke in the House of Commons and the expulsion of a single diplomat. I mean, I know it's early days in this, but surely that invites a stronger response than what we're seeing right now.
And the response will evolve as the investigation evolves and as further and better information comes to light. So we're very much following the evidence and the intelligence. We also want the appropriate law enforcement authorities to have the ability to investigate fully, and we hope ultimately bring before Canadian justice those that perpetrated these crimes. So a precipitous action by the Government of Canada in any way that might even remotely impact the ability of law enforcement to conduct their investigation independently would be the height of irresponsibility, and that's why we're going to be very prudent to ensure that they can do that work.
That was Minister of Public Safety Dominic LeBlanc. For more on this stunning revelation, I'm joined now by Leah West. Leah is an Associate Professor of International Affairs and National Security Law at Carleton University. Leah West, let's start with your reaction to this allegation. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. What's your take?
I was dumbfounded. It truly is unprecedented. The word that we should never use for things actually applies in this situation. The fact that you had a prime minister stand on the floor of the House of Commons and reveal for the first time publicly that that someone from the Canadian Sikh community had been targeted and killed, and they believe it was by the Indian government, a government that just finished hosting the G20 summit, is really remarkable. It's a first on many fronts.
It's an allegation based on intelligence, and we know from our many conversations about the foreign interference issue over the past number of weeks and months that intelligence doesn't always translate into usable evidence. So with all of the caveats we've heard about the value and strength and weaknesses of intelligence, how should Canadians assess what the Prime Minister did today and the allegations he's making?
Well, usually when we're having those caveats, it's because a document has been leaked or a transcript of a conversation has been leaked in the media, and we're trying to assess the relevance, the credibility of that piece of intelligence, and we're trying to urge caution. Right here, what we're talking about is the Government of Canada's assessment of what has happened, and it'll be based on a plethora of intelligence and evidence, not a single source kind of document where we've really been what we've been seeing when we've been talking about foreign interference, at least in the Chinese context, the last six months. The fact that you have enough for the Prime Minister to make the statement on the floor of the House of Commons leads me to believe that they believe strongly in the credibility of the intelligence that they're relying on.
Right. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau giving that statement on the floor of the House of Commons, raising this directly with Narendra Modi on the sidelines of the summit at the G20 in India, and the head of CSIS and the National Security Advisor going to India to speak to their counterparts over there about this. So, I mean, what the Prime Minister did, you sort of walked through, but the fact that David Vigneault and Jody Thomas went to India to speak directly with people in the Indian government and the intelligence services, what does that tell us?
Again, the intelligence they have is very credible and reliable. They wouldn't be making those kinds of trips and having those discussions at the highest levels if they didn't think they could back it up. I think it's interesting that it was done quietly first. And perhaps that means that they don't suspect that it occurred at the highest levels of government. The allegation may not stem from there, but I think it is important to remember that the research analysis wing that the individual was alleged to have been a member of that was expelled today reports directly to the Prime Minister of India. So I think we should take from this that the allegations are highly credible.
Yeah, you mentioned one person has been expelled, and I asked Dominic LeBlanc if that's enough, right? When you're making the allegation that a foreign state is maybe involved in an extrajudicial killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil, the expulsion of a single diplomat doesn't seem proportional. I mean, how do you anticipate something like this might play out compared to what we see maybe in other countries?
Yeah, and I should just correct myself and say that they were declared persona non grata. So it is up to they've lost their diplomatic status, and it's up for the diplomat to leave on their own terms. I think that this is a first step. If we think back to another comparable situation to the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, for example, it was 2 years before the U.S. government released a declassified report and sanctioned 76 officials in Saudi Arabia. So while an investigation is ongoing, while there's still an ongoing criminal investigation into who was involved, I don't suspect we can see direct action against any of those individuals until the investigation is pretty well wrapped up, or at least decisions have been made about whether or not Canada will pursue a criminal investigation against anyone or a criminal prosecution against anyone. Right.
Yeah, the RCMP is investigating, and Dominic LeBlanc said he spoke with the head of the RCMP today to get a sense of where things were with that, but obviously not divulging any details on where the investigation and any potential prosecution could be. But I wonder how challenging all of this makes it, like in terms of how challenging will accountability prove to be in a case like this. I mean, we don't know what India's responses is. We don't know if they've been asked to cooperate, if they will cooperate, and obviously we don't really know where the police are in this. I mean, what's your sense of how difficult that might be?
I suspect if those two individuals who committed the crime were in Canada before this, they won't be very long, or they wouldn't have tried to stick around for very long, because this does tip the government's hand or the investigators' hand, obviously, and so it does reveal quite a bit, even just to acknowledge that they think that the Indian government was involved. So I am suspect about whether or not we'll see a prosecution of anyone in Canada. My hunch would be that the gunmen are long gone. We could potentially see charges brought against individuals. But if they're no longer in Canada, you need the cooperation of wherever they are, potentially in India, to bring those people back to Canada, extradite them for prosecution. Potentially, you could get Indian cooperation on that front. All of this, it's way too soon to tell, but I'd be pretty suspect to think that the people who actually pulled the trigger are still in this country.
You know, I don't know if the government, Leah, intended to go public with this at this point in time with intelligence. They tend to guard that pretty closely. It seems, based on the timeline that I saw today, that the Globe and Mail was out a few minutes ahead of the Prime Minister with a well-reported and obviously now completely corroborated story about this. I mean, does this potentially limit the government's intelligence capacity having to go public with something like this and announce something like this? Is there any impact on that aspect of looking into exactly what happened here?
Yes, it does. And I saw Bob Fife in another interview say that the government asked him for a week to delay putting out the story. And he said, no, we can only give you 24 hours. And that's not uncommon in situations where there's ongoing investigations for governments, Canada, the United States, et cetera, to ask for reporters to sit on stories, because it does have an impact on investigations, on investigators, on sources that may go dark as a result of this hitting the media. Obviously, so forcefully as it has today. So it does have an impact, but it does sound like, the highest levels of government and the Canadian government was kind of firing on all cylinders when it comes to this issue for the last several weeks.
Okay, Leah West, we always appreciate it when you answer the bat signal. We appreciate your insight. Associate Professor of International Affairs and National Security Law at Carleton University. Thanks for your time.